Picture this, a royal linen shift, once white and delicate, now yellowed, crusted, and so stiff with filth it can stand upright on its own, not tucked away in some forgotten dungeon. No, this was worn proudly by one of Europe's most powerful queens. Her name? Isabella Wawai of Castile. And according to a chilling legend, during the bloody siege of Granada, she vowed not to change or remove that undergarment for 8 months straight, not until the city fell and the last Muslim king surrendered. Through blood, sweat, and unspeakable stench, she wore it like a badge of holy war. But why? Why would a woman of unimaginable wealth, who could have bathed in perfume and silk, choose to live in filth? This isn't just a story about poor hygiene. It's about how faith twisted into fanaticism, how filth became sacred, and how a queen weaponized her body to conquer both her enemies and her own reputation. Because what's most disturbing is that none of this was seen as madness, it was seen as divine. And the further we go into her story, the more it smells of something far darker than just unwashed linen. The sun barely crests the horizon as a young lady in waiting tiptoes into Queen Isabella's tent. She doesn't speak. She barely breathes. The air is thick, a choking mix of incense, sweat, blood, and something else. Something rotting. Isabella kneels motionless on a coarse mat, whispering prayers, her hands clasped so tightly they're purple at the knuckles. She hasn't bathed. She hasn't changed. Not in weeks, maybe months. Her linen shift clings to her like a second skin, drenched, brittle, alive with fleas. To anyone else it would be unbearable, but to Isabella it's an act of holy resistance. Each foul breath, each itch, each crusted layer of filth brings her closer to God's will, and closer to the fall of Granada. Her court dares not question it. Some say she hasn't slept through the night in months. Others whisper she wakes screaming, clutching relics, mumbling verses. Whether out of awe or fear, no one challenges her resolve, because she isn't just waging war on the Moors. She's at war with her own body. This wasn't madness. This was deliberate. A queen proving she could suffer like a saint. And in the twisted logic of 15th century Spain, the more she wreaked, the more righteous she became. To modern ears, it sounds absurd. How could cleanliness ever be a sin? But in the ruthless world of 15th century Spain, dirt wasn't just tolerated, it was worshipped. The Catholic Church preached that the body was a vessel of temptation. To indulge it, to bathe it, perfume it, or pamper it, was to flirt with sin. Vanity was the devil's mirror. And so the faithful turned to filth. The holiest saints were those who stank the worst, wore lice-infested robes, and let their flesh rot in the name of penance. To suffer physically was to purify the soul. So when Queen Isabella swore not to change her clothes during the siege, she wasn't being rebellious. She was being righteous. Even priests praised her vow. Her filth became a symbol of holy endurance, her rotting shift, an offering to God. And to the people around her, her odour wasn't offensive. It was sacred, because in a world ruled by fear of eternal damnation, soap couldn't cleanse the soul, but suffering could. And what Isabella endured was only the beginning. The year was 1491. Spain was at war again. But this wasn't just any battle. It was the final act of the centuries-long Reconquista, a brutal campaign to purge the Iberian Peninsula of Muslim rule. Queen Isabella wasn't just a monarch, she saw herself as a crusader, chosen by God to finish what generations had started. But while swords clashed outside Granada's walls, death crept through the Christian camps. The plague had returned, bubonic, relentless, soldiers died in droves, priests choked on their last prayers, bodies piled in makeshift pits, the stench of rot indistinguishable from that of the living. And that's when Isabella made her vow. Some say it came to her in a fevered dream. Others say she believed it was divine punishment, that God demanded sacrifice. So she gave him her skin. No washing, no changing, no relief. She would wear the same undergarment, soiled, stained, and crawling, for as long as the siege lasted. And the court? They watched in stunned silence as their queen turned herself into a martyr in flesh. This wasn't vanity. It wasn't madness. It was strategy, both spiritual and political. Because while Granada starved behind its walls, Isabella weaponized her body into a symbol of Christian suffering, a rotting, relentless reminder that she would not rest until her enemies burned. And soon they would. 8 months, one garment, no washing, no changing, no relief. Queen Isabella's vow was as horrifying as it was holy. She pledged to wear a single linen shift day and night until Granada fell. This wasn't symbolic. This was literal skin sacrifice. Imagine layers of grime, dried sweat, blood from sores, and excrement from a body too exhausted to function. The fabric fused to her skin, creating a living shroud of rot. Witnesses said her ladies-in-waiting gagged when they approached her. The stench of decay clung to everything she touched. Her once regal scent, replaced by the smell of flesh slowly breaking down. And yet, no one dared intervene, because to question the queen was to question God's plan. To Isabella, this was more than a vow. It was spiritual warfare. Each day she remained wrapped in filth, she believed, brought Spain closer to divine victory. Her suffering became a weapon. When Granada finally surrendered in January 1492, she removed the shift, or rather, it peeled off her. According to chroniclers, parts of it had bonded to her skin. It had to be cut away, piece by piece, and underneath, sores, infections, wounds of holy purpose. She didn't flinch, she didn't cry, because in her mind she had bled for God, and now Spain was his. To understand Isabella's vow, you have to look beyond the palace walls, into the twisted theology of dirt as devotion. In 15th century Spain, cleanliness wasn't linked to health, it was linked to sin. The church taught that washing the body tempted the flesh. To cleanse the skin was to invite vanity, and vanity, of course, led straight to damnation. The holiest figures, they were the ones who rejected water entirely. Take St. Francis of Assisi. He was said to wear the same filthy tunic for years, crawling with lice. St. Margaret of Cortona refused to bathe, believing the stench of her body kept men and temptation away. And St. Agnes? She was praised for letting her flesh rot in isolation as an act of supreme piety. Isabella didn't invent the idea, she inherited it. By wearing the same shift for 8 months, she aligned herself with these suffering saints, signaling to her people that she too was chosen, not just to rule, but to endure. Her festering body became a public proclamation. I will conquer Granada not with beauty, not with wealth, but with holy rot. And for the church, it worked. Isabella's physical decay was rebranded as spiritual glory. Her sores were seen not as wounds, but as proof of divine favour. Because in a world where saints were measured by how badly they smelled, Isabella was practically a goddess. A king could bleed and be seen as brave. A queen could rot and be seen as divine. But that wasn't always the case. For most women of her time, filth was a curse, used to shame, control, and dehumanize. A dirty body meant a fallen woman, a sinful temptress, a failure. But Queen Isabella, she took that weapon and turned it on its head. She didn't suffer in secret, she made her stench public policy. This wasn't just about faith, it was about gendered power. By embracing filth, she rejected the courtly ideal of the fragile, perfumed queen. She refused the expectation that women must be clean, quiet, and decorative. Instead, she became untouchable, literally and politically. Foreign dignitaries whispered of her odour. Nobles couldn't meet her eyes. Even her enemies feared her, not because of her armies, but because of her unflinching rot. It was a display of power so grotesque, it worked. In an era where women were told to disappear, Isabella made herself unforgettable. Where beauty was demanded, she offered revulsion. and where men held power through force, she claimed hers through decay. Her body, ravaged, stinking, and unyielding, became a fortress no one could storm. Because in the politics of the 15th century, Isabella discovered a terrifying truth. You don't need to be feared for what you do if they're already terrified to be near you. The history books speak of her piety. But the doctors, they would have called it a biohazard. Let's strip away the myth and face the medical nightmare Isabella became. 8 months, 1 linen shift, no baths, no ventilation, no hygiene. That's a breeding ground for fungal infections, open sores, lice, and bacterial overgrowth. The sweat alone, trapped against her body for weeks, would have broken down her skin's barrier, leading to oozing lesions and secondary infections. And that's just the start. With her immune system weakened by constant stress and malnutrition from the wartime campaign, she likely developed septic skin ulcers where flesh literally dies and decays on the bows. The shift, soaked with blood, pus, and excrement, would have hardened into a second skin, a crusted shell of filth that tore the flesh when moved. Contemporary reports even suggest that her attendants needed knives and hot water to remove it, slicing away not just fabric, but pieces of Isabella herself. And the smell? That wasn't just sweat. It was necrosis, dead tissue, rot, a queen turning into a relic before she was even buried. But here's the paradox. The more she decayed, the more the church glorified her. The more she suffered, the more holy she became. In modern terms, it was medical neglect. In her time, it was sanctity. A rotting body wasn't a warning sign. It was a miracle in motion. Centuries have passed, but the tale of Isabella's vow refuses to fade into history. Why does this story grip us so tightly, long after the last thread of that stained shift has turned to dust? Because it's more than just a myth about hygiene. It's a mirror reflecting our deepest fears and fascinations. A powerful woman who chooses filth over beauty. A queen who uses decay as armor. A ruler whose faith blurs the line between devotion and madness. This story unsettles us because it challenges everything we believe about power and purity. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that beneath the crown lies flesh, weak, mortal, and vulnerable. And it taps into an ancient human obsession, the battle between the sacred and the profane, the holy and the horrifying. Isabella's shift is a symbol, a relic of a world where faith demanded suffering, and suffering was the highest form of power. Even now it haunts how we think about leadership, gender, and the price of devotion. Because in the end, it's not just about a queen's unwashed garment, it's about how far anyone might go to prove their faith, and what we're willing to believe when faith becomes obsession. Isabella's story might sound unbelievable, maybe even repulsive, but it reveals something far deeper about the human spirit and the world she lived in. In 15th century Spain, filth wasn't just dirt, it was a symbol of devotion, a language of power, and a path to sanctity. To embrace uncleanliness was to reject the earthly and step closer to the divine. It was a ritual of suffering that blurred the line between pain and prayer. Isabella's stained shift stands as a testament to a time when faith demanded the unimaginable, when bodies were battlegrounds and purity was measured not in cleanliness but in endurance. Her legacy is complicated, part martyr, part monarch, part myth. But one thing is clear, the story of a queen who wore filth as a crown forces us to rethink what devotion really means. Maybe it's not about perfection, but about the sacrifices we're willing to make in its name. And perhaps beneath the grandeur of history's kings and queens, there lies a raw, uncomfortable truth, that sometimes faith looks less like glory and more like grime